This is the story of the most sophisticated interplanetary spacecraft ever built, and why for now it's still down here on Earth. It's a billion-dollar saga of science, engineering, and politics, of individual effort and national policy, of technological innovation and managerial indecision. It's a case study of the Galileo mission and its travels on the rocky road to Jupiter.
Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. Additional funding was provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And by Allied Signal, a technology leader in aerospace, electronics, automotive products, and engineered materials.
Jupiter is the largest planet in our solar system, large enough to hold 1,000 Earths. The purpose of the mission was to study it as never before, to sample its turbulent atmosphere, and to survey its 4 most intriguing moons, including Io, the most volcanic body in the solar system, and Europa with its icy crust. They were first seen by the astronomer Galileo, for whom the mission was named. Originally to be launched in 1982, Galileo was repeatedly postponed. Finally, launch was set for May 1986. It was to be the first planetary mission to ride the shuttle. But now the spacecraft sits in the clean room here on Earth where it was built, with no chance of launch before November 1989. And the head of NASA has floated the possibility of cancellation. Galileo had problems even before the sad morning of January 28, 1986, when Challenger exploded in the cold skies above Cape Canaveral. Seven brave astronauts died that morning. And America's space program, manned and unmanned, commercial and scientific, came to a complete stop. The Galileo mission to Jupiter was one of the projects most seriously affected by the tragedy. Over the years, Galileo had become part of many lives, of the men and women who worked to pull it all together.
That's fine.
Laboring at the usually unseen tasks of building spacecraft, working round the clock on hardware problems, in meeting after technical meeting. It's a twisted tale of politics, technology, and science. A case study of what America can do best, and how national space policy has faltered in the past 20 years. It's a story best told by the people who have shaped the mission. Gentry Lee, project engineer and computer expert. He was instrumental in the Viking mission to Mars and hoped the Jovian Odyssey of Galileo would rival the success of 1976. James Van Allen, physicist and discoverer of Earth's radiation belts in 1958, the first achievement of space science. After the trailblazing Pioneer mission to Jupiter, he headed the science working group that created Galileo. Torrance Johnson, project scientist, his job to coordinate the 17 onboard experiments. As a member of the Voyager team, he relished being among the first to view pictures coming back across millions of miles to Earth. John Cassani, project manager, seen here in 1959 at work on Pioneer 4 with Van Allen and Werner von Braun. A veteran of Mariner and Voyager, his job on Galileo was to cope with Congress, complex machinery, and almost constant changes to the mission.
Jupiter is a fascinating planet.
And current NASA Administrator James Fletcher, who first sold President Nixon on the space shuttle, headed NASA when Galileo began, and returned to the agency after the Challenger explosion.
Well, one of the, I think, more unique aspects of the Galileo has been its very rocky history. The project was originally started in October '77, and at that time we were planning a launch in January of '82. We would have been the 27th launch off the shuttle, according to the schedule that was laid back in those days.
I've characterized the history of Galileo Project as the perils of Pauline. It's been, I think, formally canceled at least 4 times during its history. I mean, it's just sort of hanging by its fingernails, as did Pauline at one time, and when somebody comes along and rescues it. So this has gone through that kind of peril at least 4 times now, and we're not launched yet.
I don't want to cancel Galileo. It's one of the programs that started when I was here. But you have to raise the question, gee, has time gone by so far that there isn't a better mission that you can do by the time Galileo will arrive? And we had to ask ourselves that question, and the answer came back, no, Galileo is still the best thing we can do at this time.
To appreciate what's been lost in the delays to Galileo, you have to go behind the scenes. Everything seemed on the home stretch when at 3 a.m. on December 19, 1985, Galileo began the first 3,000-mile leg of its half-billion-mile journey. At the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, the spacecraft is readied for a 4-day high-speed truck convoy across America. The goal is to get to the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida, where many tests await, before Christmas.
All right, we got it.
The convoy rolls out of Pasadena by night, accompanied by government escorts. Its drivers have not been told the exact route they'll be taking. Galileo is to be powered by plutonium units. There's worry about anti-nuclear protesters and a fear of terrorist attack. It was in 1610 that Galileo first observed Jupiter's 4 large moons, now to be surveyed close up by the spacecraft named after him. The first glimmerings of the project were in the mid-60s, though Congress did not fund it till 1977. As the first planetary mission to be launched from the shuttle, routine emergencies were expected, so the JPL engineers would stay in Florida until the launch. They'd been rolling all night and all day, stopping only for gas and food. For most major missions, NASA has launched 2 identical spacecraft, but it could only afford 1 Galileo, making the trip more nerve-wracking for electrical engineer Tom Shing.
To me, it's somewhat scary. It's a big responsibility. You tend to worry about it. You think of the repercussions. Should we get sideswiped driving along here or something like that? Well, there's an awful lot of people working an awful lot of long hours on this thing for something like that to happen. So you tend to, that's in the back of your mind. It is mine as I'm driving. Maybe that's one of the reasons I'm having a hard time sleeping. But
this was how Galileo's trip began. Arrival at Jupiter was supposed to be like this. After a 2-year flight, it would reveal its unique character as 3 spacecraft in one, an orbiter with both remote sensors and advanced cameras, as well as fields and particles detectors, and an entry probe that for the first time would sample the atmosphere of one of the solar system's giant gas planets. After release, the probe is on its own, with no course correction and just one-way radio contact with the orbiter. Scientists think Jupiter's atmosphere will tell us much about the material that formed our entire solar system.
And this is our first chance to actually go there and measure that stuff directly, the things that we can't tell just from our telescopes, and we can never be able to tell from our telescopes, down below the clouds, and measuring the types of things that one does in the laboratory when you have samples in your hand of either gas or rock.
As the probe sinks into the clouds, it will relay data back to the orbiter, then onto Earth, for about an hour, until its destruction by heat and pressure. The Galileo orbiter will next begin a prolonged series of loops around Jupiter and its moons.
We will have a residency period there of almost 2 years, and we will be able to make repeated close-up observations of the satellites.
Galileo will bring home for all the members of this planet an entire mini solar system, up close and personal. By studying Jupiter and its moons over a long period of time, we will suddenly begin to understand the fundamental questions of the evolution of the solar system, how bodies like planets and moons form.
After a journey of 500 million miles, Galileo will swoop less than 125 miles above Europa.
Frozen cracked surfaces that we saw very poorly with Voyager. And it could be a wildly fascinating place when we get high-resolution Landsat quality photos of it.
This is a Voyager picture of Europa. And this is a simulation showing the expected improvement to come from Galileo. Galileo will be passing 20 to 100 times closer to Jupiter's moons, and its cameras are technically superior. Galileo will fly 725 miles above Io, which erupts a ton of sulfur every second, the most geologically active object in the solar system. And Galileo will study not just Jupiter and its moons, but will plunge continuously through its powerful magnetic field over the 2 years of the mission.
There are huge magnetic structures in space, and Jupiter's is the most powerful one outside the sun itself that we've got available to us. A very strong magnetic field, tilted, rotating, emitting radio signals. It's an astrophysical object, effectively. It has many things in common with the physics that are involved in things like pulsars, for instance. And here we've got one of these things not 100 million light years away, but we've got it in our backyard, celestially speaking.
In November 1985, when the scientists thought the May 86 launch was certain, they got together for the first time to hash out what the spacecraft should be doing in each minute of its 2 years of orbits. 17 principal investigators from 6 nations will fly experiments on board Galileo. More than 100 scientists work with them. Some of them have been planning since the 1960s. With so few planetary missions to generate new research, the allocation of precious spacecraft time provokes some courteous but real disputes about how to carve up the orbits. In this case, between Andy Ingersoll, whose interest is Jupiter's atmosphere, and Hal Mazursky, more concerned with the surfaces of the moons.
In fact, I think one scenario is for the atmospheres to go home for a meeting or two, and for the satellite people to plan out the whole mission, and then we'll come on and see what you've got, and we'll say, look, you haven't given us enough, we want to squeeze you a little, but then we'll basically fill in the holes.
We like that, and
of course you like it, and if we trusted you, it might be the way to go.
Well, we're having one of our first meetings to put together the tools we're going to need to decide what we actually do with the mission we've selected. We have a rather clear group idea, I think, about what our overall objectives at Jupiter are and how they relate to one another. This is not a bunch of individual investigators, each pursuing his own thing with no thought about the context that he's doing it in.
To make things even more exciting around the Europa encounter, the Io closest approach is just a few hours after Europa closest approach. It's obviously going to be an easy observation. Io is almost directly behind Europa.
how many hours do you want between on the 2 days? If he's going to put...
Until we get more trajectory data, we can't say, but it's probably evenly spread out over about a 2-day period.
Any change in launch vehicle and launch date means all these scientific and technical decisions have to be reconsidered. The Challenger disaster caused the most serious slip in the history of the project. But the design of the mission and the reasons for its earlier delays are rooted in America's space policies of the past 25 years. 1962, the first interplanetary mission from Earth, Mariner 2, blasts off to fly by Venus, returning scientific data from a vast distance. 1965, Mariner 4 sends back the first photograph from another planet, Mars. And the idea of gravity assist is thought up. This ingenious technique of using the pull of one planet to slingshot a spacecraft onto its next destination was to help Galileo on many occasions. 1969, man walks on the moon. 1973, Pioneer 10 arrives at Jupiter, and everything previously known about the planet is up for revision. Early 1976, Van Allen's Science Working Group proposes an ambitious future mission to visit Jupiter with an orbiter and a probe. It's known as JOP, the Jupiter Orbiter Probe. That same year, as the Viking landers touch down on Mars, an invitation to experiment on JOP goes out, and nearly 500 scientists say, yes, please. 1977, the twin Voyager spacecraft are launched. 2 years later, they send back spectacular photographs as they fly, all too speedily, past Jupiter. In 1978, the last American interplanetary mission to date is launched to Venus. The golden age of American space science was based upon the proven strategy of using expendable unmanned rockets. But that was changing as NASA studied how to fit future planetary missions aboard the space shuttle, approved in 1972 as the nation's next major space activity after Apollo. 1977, NASA asks Congress to approve funds for JOP. Launch is to be by shuttle in 1982, arriving at Jupiter in 1985. The cost $455 million. But the House Appropriations Subcommittee says no. They'd been pressured by deep space astronomers to support the ambitious and expensive space telescope and thought NASA could not afford two such large projects at the same time while still developing the shuttle. JOP supporters lobby hard, saying lack of approval would undermine the nation's capacity for planetary science. Convinced, the Senate okays the mission. The full House reconsiders and restores funds. JOP gets its new start in October 1977. But it's one step forward and one step back. For by this time, the shuttle system is missing an essential piece. Budget cuts have killed all plans for a custom-built space tug to boost spacecraft up and away from low Earth orbit, which is as high as the shuttle can go. So NASA improvised by modifying the upper stage of a rocket the Air Force was developing for use on the shuttle. It was called the IUS.
We call it an interim upper stage because we always knew we wanted to go for the tug, but somewhere along the line that got changed to inertial upper stage. They did, because it ceased to be interim, it was the only upper stage for a while.
In February 1978, the mission is given the name Galileo, but it still waits for a launcher and an upper stage. The innovative shuttle was months behind schedule, millions over budget, and suffering technical problems. Its reusable main rocket engines kept on failing. Its heat shield tiles kept coming loose. And the clock was ticking. Planetary missions have launch windows, times when the positions of the planets make for easier voyages. The gravity of Mars could help the spacecraft get to Jupiter if Galileo could be launched in 1982.
We had gone from the 28th launch on the shuttle to the 22nd launch to the 18th launch to the 15th launch, and finally when we were going to be the 7th mission launched off the shuttle. See, our date was in January 82 was holding fixed, but the shuttle dates were slipping. It became clear that we weren't just going to get there.
The Air Force complained that Galileo had turned out to be too heavy for its new upper stage. NASA countered that the IUS was delivering less power than expected.
First thing that happened is that the IUS on the shuttle couldn't quite make it, and so they said, all right, we'll send it in two parts, the probe on one part and the satellite on another part.
So right away, what happens to the mission? First of all, the cost of launching it doubles because we need two launch vehicles. The launch is delayed 2 years. That increases cost to the mission. We have to develop a new vehicle to carry the probe, something called a probe carrier.
Launch becomes February and March 1984. Arrival at Jupiter, July 1986. The cost jumps to $650 million.
So now when the Congress had approved something 2 years earlier, suddenly the cost of doing that now has gone up with no real increase in value to the mission.
Now Congress suggests replacing the solid fuel IUS with a new version of the Centaur upper stage, which had been used successfully atop the Atlas and Titan expendable rockets. But NASA said it would be difficult and dangerous and cost $100 million to fit the volatile liquid-fueled Centaur into the shuttle. 1981, the Reagan administration is new to Washington, and OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, is out to cut every budget except defense.
Letting the Air Force develop the IUS for planetary missions, that just wasn't a good idea in retrospect. They thought they could do it for $100 million. That was their quote, and it turned out to be $900 million. And they put a whole lot of bells and whistles on it that increased the cost.
With rising costs and continuing poor performance, NASA's IUS is canceled.
And that left us with no launch vehicle. Well, NASA took up the development of the Centaur, but that couldn't be implemented for another year, so we were pushed off to 1985.
The Centaur upper stage helped launch Viking and Voyager, but for the shuttle it requires careful and expensive adaptation. Launch becomes 1985, arrival at Jupiter 1987, and the cost rises to $695 million. Now Budget Director David Stockman looks to chop $600+ million. The entire Galileo project is threatened with cancellation. Through 1981, there's technical progress, but budget pressures continue. The President's science advisor recommends halting all planetary missions for a decade. Next year, the Pentagon spends more on space than NASA. December 1981, NASA decides there are too few missions to justify Centaur's costs and cancels it. Back to the IUS. Launch slips just 1 month, but Galileo will take 2¼ years longer to get to Jupiter, since the weaker IUS requires a less direct route, using Earth for a gravity assist. Costs jump to $864 million. But Congress objects to paying more for extending the mission, delaying the scientific return, and leaving the shuttle without an adequate upper stage. It directs NASA to build Centaur.
This allowed us to put the whole mission back together the way we wanted to, but in the meantime, the Centaur development had been stopped for 8 or 9 months. So by the time the guys could get back and up to gear on that, we lost another year. And so we went from an 85 mission to an 86 mission. That's really a tortuous history.
Launch is set for May 86, arrival at Jupiter August 88, and the cost stabilizes at $874 million. But the strange tale of IUS and Centaur was not yet over. The spaceship that emerged from this untidy process and came to life at JPL was, paradoxically, the most advanced unmanned craft ever built to fly to the planets. Down here on Earth, it must be bathed in filtered air, its skin stitched with a surgeon's care, its delicate parts handled with respect. It's all designed for weightlessness, literally out of its element on Earth. On this planet, it lingers in intensive care. It's built for space. An advanced craft like Galileo shares some characteristics with living organisms. Its eyes are television cameras, the most sensitive ever flown. Its brains are computers known as the CDS, the Command and Data System, and the AACS, the Attitude and Articulation Control System. Instead of arms and legs, it moves by blasts of gas from the nozzles of its maneuvering engines. Its energy will come from RTGs, radioisotope thermoelectric generators, which produce power by the radioactive decay of plutonium. But the two most difficult pieces to fit together are the upper and lower sections. Their complex engineering allows the Galileo orbiter to be 2 ships in 1. The upper section, like the Pioneer spacecraft, will spin to sample phenomena such as Jupiter's magnetic field. The lower section is despun to be a stable platform for instruments like Voyager's cameras, which had returned spectacular images from the outer planets. This dual-spun design is unique for a planetary probe, and unlike anything in everyday life. It's as if your head had to spin endlessly round and round atop your neck. In the last 3 months of 1985, putting the pieces together became a 3-dimensional jigsaw puzzle with millions of parts. It was a race against the approaching deadline of the May 1986 launch window. If the project missed that date, they would have to wait 13 months for another opportunity. But it was a low-tech problem that threatened the schedule in December 1985 when the memory chips of the CDS computer were damaged. There'd been some unexplained failures, and these technicians had to strip off a protective coating from the chips to test them. They had used an alcohol cleaner, but the alcohol damaged connections which previously had been satisfactory. Now every chip had to be checked, many removed and resoldered, and they were way overdue in getting the CDS integrated with the spacecraft. By early January, they had fixed enough chips and connections so that whole trays could be checked. Now another crew worked round the clock testing the trays. If the memory boards weren't functioning correctly, it could jeopardize the entire mission. With its components assembled, the entire spacecraft has to be tested to ensure it can survive the rigors of launch and life in space. And not just hardware. Galileo's complex software needs testing also, and that tests human ingenuity as well.
In the old days, in the good old days, if I can say that, test engineering before you launched was simply a case of putting the spacecraft through everything it could possibly do. and you check them off one by one. Now, you could not do it. One of my young engineers computed that it would take 55 years to test Galileo at every one of its possible logical functions and all the reasonable logical combinations. The mechanism then becomes who knows what area. It's more like a doctor in a sense, is diagnosing a patient. Sees a few things that don't look right in a given area and says, maybe there's some trouble there. I better get all the people who know that particular area to look at it.
This meeting brings together computer programmers and the engineers who have been test flying the spacecraft.
All right, now, last time Arden walked in here with this problem about the two CDSs fighting with each other. And this is a specific
The engineers have given the spacecraft the intelligence to do some of its own diagnosis.
Essentially meters its own performance, and when it detects a lack of health in a given region, responds accordingly and sends a message to the ground and says, I'm not all right.
The problem is, the spacecraft is so intelligent that some of its onboard systems can get into an argument with others about exactly who's in charge.
That the string is still down. At this point,
The aim is to find a way to help the spacecraft recover and once again find its bearings. It must make its two main computers work together, not fight.
Well, the question in my mind, I think, is that what kind of schizophrenic behavior is attitude control going to be?
If we're getting two separate time messages, we'll believe one of them. And line
that solves your problem, but doesn't solve the rest of the spacecraft's problems. See, by your looking at those time messages, you can take over. So the AECS can say the CDS is screwed up, therefore I'm going to do sun acquisition and sit and wait for the ground, which is really what you should do.
In addition to internal brainstorming, Galileo has an outside review board which meets regularly at JPL to consider problems and progress.
Absolutely as it will be. If you then
The board is made up of space veterans, people like James Martin, project manager for the highly successful Viking mission to Mars, where he was Gentry's boss. It is sometimes tough convincing wise old hands like these that everything is under control.
So what will happen in that situation, if you're the other perfectly good backup CDS, you read the main signal says I'm okay, then you read the other signal says I'm okay, then you check your time code and it's different from that guy, you say, I'm sick, down you go, they're both down, that's bad.
Does that have to be fixed pre-launch?
I mean, very blunt. My recommendation is don't fix it at all or fix it now. When you get into the middle of engineering a major system, it's like the trees in the forest. You sometimes get so buried in the detailed problems you can't see the overview. What a review board does is makes you sit down first of all, think about what it is you're doing, how you're going to explain it to other people, and then allows them to hear it as new listeners. And suddenly, it's like a prism in front of your eyes being turned. They see different colors. And when they see different colors, suddenly you say, hey, I hadn't thought about that myself.
The impression I have is that you have designed such a smart machine that it is beyond human knowledge to figure out if it's working right or can work right and can never work wrong.
I do not believe there is a long list of items not on the foil that will manifest itself later.
There's no way of knowing how long the list is.
I have no way of knowing. But Jim, we had problems like this on Viking that we didn't find out about until we landed on the surface of Mars. Okay? And we never knew how long that list was either. So it's a question of engineering judgment and prudence.
There'd been software problems on previous missions, but this was to be the first time human astronauts would be directly involved in the launch of an interplanetary spacecraft, another way in which Galileo was to be unique. One day in November '85, the crew of the space shuttle Atlantis came to visit JPL, to view progress and to get up close to the spacecraft before they might need to work on it in spacesuits. Ox Van Hoften, one of the Galileo crew, was a veteran of the shuttle. He'd grappled with a satellite in orbit, fixed it, and sent it back to work. The Galileo team felt pleased to have professionals like him associated with their project.
And toward the others, don't look at me.
Many in NASA argued it was only the presence of humans in the loop that would generate public interest and excitement in scientific missions. Others, mostly outside NASA, argued that flying humans to launch science missions like Galileo increased costs and involved unnecessary risks. But in November, doubts about mixing manned and unmanned flight were put aside. The attitude was that everybody was on the same team, and the goal, merely good science at Jupiter.
I had said at one point to Ox, you know, Ox, wouldn't it be great to be able to put on our spacesuits and go out and just join this thing on its trip to Jupiter? And Ox said, well, that'd be real neat for about 8 hours, but what do you do when the air runs out?
But the worry that somehow, somewhere, there was some unanticipated fault that could jeopardize the entire mission, a so-called single-point failure, continued to nag away at Galileo's managers. A month later, on December 13th, late on a Friday afternoon, after 4.5 days of intense meetings, the advisory board gathered once again for an even more important pre-ship review.
John, what is the situation before the Centaur is fired?
The decision today would be whether continuing problems with the CDS, the attitude control system, and a few other issues meant the spacecraft should be kept at JPL for more work or sent as scheduled to Cape Kennedy to begin its complex integration with the yet untried Centaur rocket and the shuttle.
We have looked at the problem of recovering the spacecraft from orbit. It is virtually an impossibility. There are no provisions on the spacecraft for mechanical attachment or recapture, and we're going to Jupiter or we're not going anywhere.
At the end of the day, to ship or not to ship, that was the question.
Would you not ship?
I see no reason why not to.
I certainly see no reason not to ship.
Brooks.
Taken by itself, this is an uncomfortable risk. But I believe that's also the name of the game for Galileo. Yes, I would ship.
Nothing I heard in this room would keep me from doing that. Some things I heard in the home, right?
If I were project manager of this project, I would not ship that spacecraft until I had that ACS working properly. I do believe that if you're talking about a control system, you need to do that here at home.
This was the lone dissenting voice, and so the vote was to ship Galileo to Florida. The spacecraft would leave JPL 6 days later.
We shall do everything in our power to make you as proud of us on the 20th of May as I know you want to be.
Right on.
Though there were at least 5 years to go, 3 years to Jupiter and 2 more years once there, things seemed well on their way, and the project threw a Christmas party. Bringing together scientists and engineers, the rocket experts in charge of the Centaur upper stage, and the technicians who were to convoy the spacecraft to Florida.
We've got a great spacecraft, we've got a great team, and from here on, we have only one way to go, and that's up, and we're on our way.
And so the cross-country convoy began. Spacecraft technicians became truckers and devotees of CB lingo.
Well, let's get somebody up there. Let's not argue
For
about
3.5 days they rolled, escorted by police, state troopers, and their shadowy government companions, without incident and without mishap. On December 23rd, tired and hungry, the convoy rolled into Kennedy Space Center, Spaceport, USA. And the staff clocked out for Christmas. In late January came one of the activities that could only be done at Kennedy. They evacuated the area around the clean room for a distance of some 200 yards, and amid great safety precautions, the spacecraft was tanked up for the first time. Galileo uses so-called hypergolic propellant, 2 different substances that ignite upon contact with each other to power the course correction jets. Loading the propulsion module was potentially a dangerous job. The crews worked 1 full day on each of the 4 tanks in carefully monitored 80-minute shifts, encased in scape suits, self-contained air-breathing personnel ensembles. For once, the technicians from JPL looked like astronauts. That same evening, there was a party to introduce the JPL staff to their new partners, the specialists from Kennedy, who would help integrate the spacecraft into the shuttle Atlantis and prepare it for launch 4 months from then. Beyond the warmth of the barbecue, it was getting chilly. A cold front was rolling in. The date was January 24th. 4 days later, Challenger exploded. John Cassani had been at the Cape, watching the liftoff.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
Everyone in that room knew what happened, the incident happened, but there wasn't a sound, not a word uttered for at least 15 or 20 seconds, and then someone said, "Oh my God." I can remember in my own mind, you know, thoughts were, we were shocked, and everyone was shocked, of course, by it, but in my own mind, I was jumping from one subject to another, from the people that were affected by it, to the shuttle program, to my own program, to our own people working on our program. How were we going to, you know, what was going to happen next?
The people that were killed are our colleagues. They're also engaged in the same endeavor, and it was it's a tremendous loss when something like that happens. But I think, you know, as with the rest of the NASA community, it's kind of part of the family. What you want to do is you go on and you try to get on with the business and do the things that those people were interested in doing, which is exploring.
On February 12th, 2 weeks after the accident, Cassani held an all-hands meeting to bring the people working on the project up to date.
And after the emotional shock of losing colleagues was over, as we began to tote up the likely impact on the Galileo spacecraft, and we began to think in terms of our careers. We just spent, in several cases, a decade getting this thing ready. And then suddenly, not only were we not on our way, we didn't even know when we would be on our way. When would it be launched?
The 86 launches for the planetary missions were being postponed or delayed, but that did not necessarily rule out the option to launch or resume launching the shuttles again by the May-June time period.
In these early days after Challenger, there was still hope that this had been just a freak accident, that the cause would be quickly found, and that shuttle flights would rapidly resume. At the very worst, it seemed to mean a delay until the next year. But as the Rogers Commission went about its work, it became increasingly obvious that the delays would be far longer than anticipated. In fact, the single-point failure that NASA always feared had already happened, not just to one mission, but to U.S. space policy. The National Space Transportation System was totally inoperative. Why?
Collectively, the country put all of its eggs in one basket. And I think we all realize that that was a mistake now. It seemed to be, for whatever reason, the good thing to do at the time.
In 1972, the United States made a fundamental policy mistake. It said not only that the shuttle would be the launch vehicle for all U.S. payloads, but that we would, on purpose, lose the capability to use other launch systems.
Now, everyone who works in technology knows that you do not go to the next generation computer, automobile, whatever it is, until it is absolutely proven out. But the expendable launch vehicles were all mothballed before the shuttle was even fully designed, much less operational.
How did it happen that all of America's space eggs were in one and only one technological basket? The United States had wished for the moon and gotten it. But in the late 60s, at a time of increasing budget pressures, NASA had to come up with something new.
We were coming down off the Apollo program, and there were some people that wanted us to go down to zero, and I think we managed to hold the place together pretty well during that period, but a lot of unfortunate consequences resulted.
Among the options were manned missions to Mars, a space station, a shuttle, and a space tug. All would cost money. But the argument was the shuttle and the tug could save money too. NASA designers had come up with many elaborate concepts, some with huge manned boosters to take an orbiter up to space, with both craft able to land at commercial airports. The orbiters would have jet engines to fly to safety in an emergency, and abort systems to protect the astronauts. But by January 1972, when President Nixon okayed the shuttle, the plans had changed. Every cost cutter, someone joked, had become a shuttle designer. Though Nixon said the shuttle was worth building just for national prestige, his budget office kept up the pressure.
We were just given a budget and said, figure out a way to meet that budget, whatever it takes. And so we had to balance off a lot of things to meet those, and it was a year-by-year thing.
The overriding criteria that drove the final design of the shuttle was getting the one-time cost down. It was mortgaging the future in order to keep the current costs low.
The innovative manned boosters were long gone, as were many of the safety systems. Soon, solid rocket boosters were chosen in preference to the liquid-fueled ones that had been on the model shown to Nixon. Liquids were more expensive to develop, though cheaper to operate. Solid rockets were cheaper up front, though more expensive to operate, and never used before in American manned flight. And by the late 70s, it was obvious a real space tug was out. The Centaur IUS debacle resulted.
But something you have to keep in mind in the political framework of the Washington scene, you hardly ever spend money up front to save money in the future. It just doesn't work that way. And we're all faced with that problem, not just NASA, but the whole government.
I think a lot of people have come to the conclusion that it was probably not a wise thing to try to develop that system on a shoestring budget, basically. And in addition to hurting the shuttle program itself, it certainly created a tremendous constraint on any other programs, in particular science and space science programs within NASA.
And as shuttle cost mounted, space scientists found that expendable rockets were no longer being maintained, even as alternatives or supplements to the shuttle.
Are the ones we use for Voyager, for example, and the ones we use for Pioneer. All of these worked beautifully. They did a great job. They were still potentially available, but the things that worked were being terminated, and the things that weren't worked were being exalted. That was a simple situation.
In the summer of 1985, months before Challenger, Van Allen wrote an article detailing the negative impact of the shuttle's rising costs and continuing delays on space science. He listed missions canceled, an American probe to Halley's Comet, a U.S. spacecraft to fly over the sun's poles, and delays to projects like Galileo, which had time-critical launch windows. He described the situation as the slaughter of the innocents.
The initial justification for the shuttle was that it could be launched routinely and cheaply and reliably, and it has not met any of those criteria. It is a technically complex system, sensitive to launch delays, difficult to use. It has been much more expensive on a use basis, a recurrent basis, than anybody anticipated when it was approved. And clearly, we've now been made aware by the accident, it is a risky system.
So Galileo, the Hubble Space Telescope, and the other great scientific missions of this decade are sitting on the ground because the programmatic problems of the shuttle caused us to be there.
The Challenger accident had a continuing impact on every aspect of U.S. space policy and on Galileo. Concerned about any increased risks for future missions, managers representing the astronauts restated their long-standing objections to carrying the liquid-fueled Centaur rocket in the cargo bay. In November '85, the Atlantis crew accepted Centaur's risks. In spring '86, they were still willing to fly it. But in April came an estimate of up to $180 million to fix safety problems and pay for additional delays. Now, some members of Congress put Fletcher in the hot seat, asking him to guarantee in writing that Centaur would fly if they spent more money on it. In June, Fletcher canceled Centaur, and it was back to IUS. One estimate pegs Centaur development at $1 billion, but it's certain that the Centaur IUS back and forth had cost several years for Galileo. Again, the change in launch vehicle meant it was back to the drawing board. IUS has less power, so Galileo would have to pick up energy by flying once past Venus and then back twice past Earth. It was an ingenious solution based on the principle of gravity assist. The engineers had learned to design trajectories like this from their earlier studies of how to navigate around Jupiter and its moons. But it would increase flight time to Jupiter by 6 years, arriving in 1995. Now, a spacecraft designed to operate in the cold, dim reaches of the outer solar system had to be given parasols to shield it from the heat of the sun. The designers tried 2 different styles of golden umbrellas before the best design was found, one that would strike a balance between heat and cold. In the aftermath of Challenger, there were other issues. Even before Centaur was canceled, an increased concern for safety brought questions about Galileo's use of plutonium fuel in its RTGs, radioisotope thermoelectric generators. For over 25 years, in missions such as Voyager and Viking, Apollo and Pioneer, U.S. spacecraft have used RTGs as relatively lightweight, dependable, and efficient energy sources. RTGs are especially useful in the cold and dark of the outer solar system. They use the radioactive decay of plutonium to produce electricity. No atomic fission or fusion is involved. The radioactive fuel pellets are heavily encased in blocks of iridium, then mounted in graphite, a material so strong it's used in the nose cones of ballistic missiles. The RTGs are designed to withstand re-entry. Galileo has 2 RTGs, each containing about 24 pounds of plutonium. In March 1986, there were congressional hearings on the issue. The immediate question was, could a Challenger-type accident release plutonium?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
At the range of a few hundred, up to a few hundred PSI, the generator would not have released material, and it would have fallen into the ocean.
Cassani and other witnesses testified that Challenger Fireball was 10 to 20 times too weak to breach the RTGs, an opinion since backed up by further studies. Many other RTG problems were reduced when the highly explosive Centaur was replaced by the generally safer IUS. But the new trajectory, as we've seen, brings Galileo back only 190 miles above Earth. If Galileo went off course, it would be traveling so fast the RTGs might burn up in the atmosphere, releasing plutonium instead of remaining intact. But JPL's navigational skills were seen in the flawless Voyager flyby of Uranus, and Galileo's onboard intelligence is being programmed to ensure it avoids Earth, even if communications fail. Still, plutonium fuel could be political dynamite.
We got to sort through all of this. Sometimes it's like pulling teeth to get you all to get some answers.
In the aftermath, not just of Challenger, but also of the Soviet nuclear disaster at Chernobyl, a national failure to resolve this question might jeopardize or delay launch of this and future missions. Even critics of NASA policy in other areas support RTGs.
From the standpoint of pure technical assessment, it's a very trivial risk, and one that I'd be happy to, sign off, so to speak, if I were a responsible public official.
We've been launching them for 25 or 30 years. You can't do planetary exploration without them. You can't have lunar bases or Mars bases or rover vehicles without these devices.
Until the shuttles fly again, no one can specify launch date, arrival at Jupiter, or even cost. But the new baseline is for a launch in late '89, arrival at Jupiter in 1995. The total cost of the mission could now be $1,363 million. $500 million over budget, more than a decade late. It will arrive nearly 30 years after such a mission was first seriously discussed.
See, now a good part of that expense, I might say, has been vacillation, has been produced by vacillation in the launch system and by many failures of the shuttle to meet its schedule, to meet its performance capabilities, indecision on the part of Congress, vacillation on the part of the agency. I think it's fair to say that all of these non-technical considerations, if you might call them that, political, programmatic considerations have perhaps doubled the cost.
So what about the future? Obviously, one of NASA's major priorities is to get the shuttle safe and flying again. But beyond that expensive and complex task, what? A space station has been one of NASA's goals since the 60s. And most people seem convinced that some kind of orbiting facility could be useful at some time, at some cost. But what design, at what cost, and when? There have been constantly evolving plans for an orbiting complex, resupplied by the shuttle, with living space, scientific labs, and experimental factories. Like the shuttle, it's supposed to do a little bit of everything for everybody. The idea was endorsed by President Reagan in his 1984 State of the Union address.
Tonight, I am directing NASA to develop a permanently manned space station and to do it within a decade.
It was supposed to cost $8 billion and be operational by 1994. In February 1987, NASA revised its estimates up to at least $13 billion. And Administrator Fletcher said the program would be stretched out so that 1995 would be the earliest it could operate.
Many of the pieces of rationale for the space station development sound an awful lot like the debates about the shuttle system back in the 70s. And honestly have to say I'm concerned when I hear some of those things going on now, that we're not getting ourselves into the same type of situation as we did with the shuttle.
Despite Reagan's support, in January 1987, the President's Office of Management and Budget chopped $288 million from the space station budget.
One of the things that continues to be worrisome to me in the decision to proceed with the space station is that the central continuing element of the presidency, that is OMB, remained opposed to the project, just as they were opposed to the shuttle and squeezed the shuttle budget throughout its history in a very non-productive way. I guess I have learned, I hope all of NASA has learned, is that you don't cut corners. When they start chopping back on the overall budget, you got to say, stop. We aren't going to build it if we're going to be cut anymore.
I think if we do continue on the present course of development of the space station, we will first of all find gross cost overruns. We'll find much more massive technical difficulties that are now anticipated. We will undoubtedly encounter a grave variety of safety problems. And finally, we'll find that it's not very much useful for anything.
Will the space station enhance or erode our nation's scientific objectives? Many scientists are concerned that last year, when NASA's overall budget rose by 12%, funding for space science decreased.
They have got to pay attention to the balance in their programs and not allow concentration on getting the shuttle flying again and getting the space station underway to completely devastate programs that are already, in many cases, hanging by a thread.
One hopes that there is some learning in the system that you can't do big, ambitious things on the cheap. Ultimately, it comes back to haunt you.
Space exploration has generated an array of practical benefits: medicine, and computers, communication satellites, and Earth resources mapping. And the new worlds explored by our spacecraft allow us all to live in an age of discovery as exciting as any in the human past.
Now, why is it important for the United States to do that? Perhaps in the long-range history of mankind it isn't. The science will get done. It may be done by Japanese scientists, European scientists, Soviet scientists. As a citizen and as somebody who would like to see the investment we have in our technical and scientific capability come to fruition and be realized, I'd like to see America be a participant in that.
We are now paying for a decade of benign neglect of our space policy. For the last 10 years, the amount of money being spent on civilian space as a percentage of our gross national product has gone gradually downward. So if we are to become leaders in space again, it will require a budgetary infusion of some significant amount.
To build a spacecraft, you need not just hardware, but also people to make the machines come to life with their dreams and hard work. For the scientists and engineers who fly the missions, it takes years of training in graduate school and later in experimental boot camp for a payoff of perhaps 3 decades of productive work. In that time, there might be at most 3 or 4 missions. But if Galileo is the norm, then the nation's best and the brightest might choose another career, and the human curiosity that must drive even robot spacecraft will be lost. On February 21, 1987, about 14 months after it left JPL for the Cape, Galileo returned to be reconfigured. It will go back for launch in May 1989.
When we began Galileo, we thought we were going to launch in January 82. We just had to swing with the punches. And we've been hit a couple of times, but by circumstances that were outside of our control, we've responded, and I think that's the way it has to be.
So what can we learn from the strange and rocky road of Galileo? That it's possible to build a spacecraft with parts that spin in different ways, but not to build a space program with policy and technical reversals every few years. That you can figure out how to stop computers from arguing with each other, but not to advance if Congress, NASA, and the science community cannot agree.
I'm not that pessimistic.
That it's possible to spin around distant planets to save fuel, but not to substitute wishful thinking for missing funds. In human, scientific, and financial terms, these have been expensive lessons, as almost everyone involved now agrees. In the case of Galileo, nearly $1.4 billion for a superb spacecraft that still sits on the ground, with another 10 years at least before it finally completes its journey.
For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Nova, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Please be sure to include the show title. To purchase film or video copies of this program for educational use, call toll-free 1-800-621-2131. In Illinois or Alaska, call Collect 312-940-1260. This program was produced by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. Additional funding was provided by Allied Signal, a technology leader in aerospace, electronics, automotive products, and engineered materials. And by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide.